It's my real privilege now to introduce you to our new generation of children, to provide the results of the first findings from growing up in New Zealand, gathered from the collection of information from the parents of those children before they were born. I'm just going to provide you with some of the highlights of what our new generation of children look like. Many of the early findings actually challenge us all to consider how we might bridge the gap better between policy development and policy delivery, especially for some of our families for whom the policies may be specifically designed. This is a new generation of New Zealanders. They are being born into a diverse group of families, and they will grow up in those diverse group of families, and that's what we need to understand. 1 in 3 of our new generation have at least one of their parents who did not grow up in New Zealand. They were born overseas and often moved here only soon before their own child was born. As Katrina has said, 20% of our children are being born into homes where English is not the main language used. And the diversity of languages that are used in those other 20% is huge, some 70 other languages being used routinely in the home environment. Perhaps sadly, te reo is poorly represented in these families in terms of everyday use in the home, and that's something that is a challenge for all of us. Alongside this diversity, our parents are increasingly ethnically diverse. Less than half of our current mothers now identify themselves primarily as European. 20% identify themselves as Māori, and a further 15% each identify themselves as of Pacific or Asian origin. This is the first longitudinal study that is able to accurately capture that diversity in a population, and that is incredibly important as we go forward to seek better solutions to some of those entrenched issues that we know exist for our families. Given the multiple ethnicities that parents bring, of course, we know that our children, the new generation of children, will be even more ethnically diverse. So this diversity of family background and home environment is particularly pertinent as we consider many aspects of policy. Particularly, how will we deliver early childhood education effectively to this generation? And how will we plan for early child health service use and engagement that is appropriate for all of our diverse families? We need to think perhaps differently about the way we plan and deliver some of those services to our new generation. As well as the diversity within the home, we know that the homes themselves are different. The environments that the families exist in are different. Half of our families now live in rental accommodation. And there's a huge degree of mobility. We know that over half of our families have moved at least twice in the last 5 years of their life, and that will continue from what we know so far. So the dream of Kiwi home ownership and raising a child in the same dwelling for their lifetime is indeed that, a dream, for more than half of our children already, and so things have changed. The growing up generation themselves are a mix of first and subsequent children, born into smaller families than previous generations, but some of them will have siblings. And those family structures are also becoming much more diverse. 1 in 4 of the children will live in an extended family situation, or in fact, with no family at all, just with mum. And that's rapidly changing. We're very interested in that transition over time. The pregnancies themselves, only 6 out of 10 were planned. And that raises important implications as we think about how we get information and advice to optimise the health of those children throughout pregnancy and before they're born, to those parents where pregnancy is perhaps not planned. It's especially the case for significant messages around smoking and around alcohol, and for supplements in pregnancy like folic acid. The growing up parents tell us that only 1 in 6 mums took any folic acid, either before or during their entire pregnancy. And we know that the rate was much lower for our unplanned pregnancy group and a much later start. Similarly, 1 in 10 of our mothers continued to smoke throughout their pregnancy. And we also saw a wide range of behaviours related to alcohol intake. Where pregnancies were unplanned, some of those behaviours that were perhaps not so safe continued well into the first few weeks of that pregnancy. And that's our concern, because if we want to get those messages out there to actually optimise health and development, we need to be targeting different ways, different strategies to let those parents understand all of those sort of pieces of information so they can be making decisions to influence the health and well-being of their children. So those findings that we see actually are a challenge to all of us. The policies are there, but there is the gap existing in terms of the family knowledge. And that's what challenges us all to go away and say, how do we think about this differently? How do we bridge that gap? How do we translate what we know at the policy table to the table of the everyday family? Interestingly, the messages about alcohol, smoking, supplementation, diet and so on in pregnancy was still not known, even though a surprising finding from the study is that most of our mums had engaged with a lead maternity carer throughout their pregnancy. Very few had failed to find a lead maternity carer of their choice and that engaged with them in a timely fashion. That's good news, and a little bit like the dream of home ownership, perhaps shatters some of the rhetoric that we often hear from the mother's point of view about the unsatisfactory system that is there for them in terms of our unique delivery of maternity services. So some interesting voices from the parents that are challenging some of the ways that we perhaps think about our population and understand how they receive messages. There's further evidence that growing up families are not receiving all of the information that is targeted to them. In particular, half of all our mothers, or almost half of all our mothers living in the most deprived areas, did not know about the Working for Families tax credits. And many parents also didn't know about paid parental leave. And this is even when it wasn't their first child. And this again just highlights the gap that exists between the reality of policy and the reality for the families. And it's important that we all step back and examine how we can do better to address what is a translation gap, particularly to get the advice, the information, the messages to perhaps our most vulnerable families who really need to hear that information most. This is only the beginning. It's the baseline findings. Already it is shedding light on a different New Zealand. It's telling us that some of the issues that we see for our children and families begin even before they're born, and they challenge us to look at the way that we deliver policy to that group of families. Over time, it will only grow in value as we continue to engage with these families who have generously given of their time, and that we will see pretty much every year and report on every year to see how these people are doing, to let you know what it's like out there for children growing up in New Zealand today. And particularly, even though we've only looked at the pregnancy, I think it challenges us to go away and not be complacent that this isn't going to be a problem for these children for another few years. It says there are things we can do now, and we must do them now, because that early phase of development is so critical for where these children will go in the future, and they are our future.